political organization usually refers to how people arrange power in a group, how we make decisions about things that shape our whole society. How do we make decisions about who gets which resources, about how we divide up land and food and income? How do we make decisions about collective morality, about what's right and wrong, what is and isn't allowed for people to do? How do we decide if we're going to war, or if we're going to build a new dam, or if we're going to let people drill for oil in a national park? Perhaps most important, who gets to make those decisions? Do some people have more of a voice than others? Are there leaders? And if so, how are they chosen? Who are those leaders working for? And what limits are there on what they can do? Now, these are questions that every culture has to answer. And like most things, every culture answers them differently. We do find some regularities, and anthropologists who study political organization have classified them into a few different types. Now, at the simplest level, for example, we can talk about band organization, the kind of political system that you find in places like the Gyeongsang. In band organization, local groups are really extended families based on relationships among them, and each band, each group, is economically pretty self-sufficient. Leadership in band societies tends to be pretty informal, and there tends to be a high level of egalitarianism, with everyone having pretty much the same amount of voice and influence in decision-making. As you get to larger societies with more people, social organization has to get more complex. You move first from simple band organization to composite band organization, which can involve a number of extended families and up to a couple of hundred people living together. In composite bands, you tend to find patterns of leadership emerging, still pretty informal, but rather than doing things by consensus, there tends to be somebody in charge, often referred to as a big man or a head man. Onka was an example of that among the Khalkha. Now, usually that's an older person, and usually he's the head of one of the larger families in the band, but there's rarely any kind of clear process by which he gets chosen. Composite bands have a lot of people to organize, but they're still small enough for everyone to know everyone else, and for things like leadership and resource allocation to remain pretty informal. Now, as societies get larger, more formal political organizations start to develop. A tribe, for example, is a political entity that includes people from a number of different settlements and locations spread out over a wide geographical area. Tribes usually have some cross-cutting social institutions that bind all of these settlements together, things like lineage ties or clans or religious organizations. You might have 20 different villages in a tribe, for example, but there will be the same set of 6 or 7 clans living in each of them. These kinds of cross-cutting affiliations hold the whole clan together, and anthropologists refer to them as sodalities. Tribes also tend to have some formal political institutions, like councils of headmen and that sort of thing. Now, that said, tribes are still relatively informal and egalitarian, and individual settlements have a lot of autonomy. That is, they're not heavily controlled from the top. Things get more structured in the sort of next stage of political organization, which we call a chiefdom. A chiefdom is a lot like a tribe, but it's got a much more formal authority system that transcends the different local settlements. It's also, and this is the key, a lot more stratified. Stratification, which is a term you'll hear a lot, refers to dividing something up into layers, like strata in the ground in geology. You can also think of stratus clouds like these, which is when clouds make a flat layer going across the sky. In a stratified society, people are divided into different classes or ranks, and the people in the higher ranks have more power and more resources than the people in the lower ones. In chiefdoms, there tends to be a chief at the top of the system, and he's usually not only politically very powerful, but also seen as having a lot of religious and ritual importance. Now, chiefdoms can be pretty big, but the largest political organizations are what we call states. A state is a kind of political organization that's based on the control of a well-defined geographic territory, and which operates politically through a bureaucracy. Now, in early states, there still tends to be a ruling elite, much like a chiefdom. A state may have a king or a queen or a pharaoh or an emperor or whoever it is up at the top, along with a ruling aristocratic class. The actual business of governing, however, and making the day-to-day decisions is delegated to a group of professional officials known as bureaucrats. In a state, this bureaucracy tends to be highly organized, formal, and complex, and that allows the control of large numbers of people and very large geographic territories. Now, we live in a state society. Like most modern states, but not all, ours is democratic. We do have a bureaucracy that runs our government, but there is no ruling elite that they serve. At least in theory, the bureaucracy serves the people who are governed, not a powerful top layer of society. Now, in societies like ours, there's always a debate over how much that's actually true. Some people, after all, have a lot more money than others, and that gives them more access to politicians and to bureaucrats. Some people have more access to power than others because of their ethnic identities, or their gender identities, or their family connections. Does that mean that we're not a democracy? Or that we're an imperfect democracy? Or something else altogether? People argue about that all the time. What they don't argue about, though, is that we're a state, a geographically defined political unit governed through a bureaucracy. Now, as time goes by, that's becoming true of more and more parts of the world. As populations increase, and as economies and societies become more complex and interconnected, it's increasingly hard for social groups to function without the mechanisms of a state political system. It's not always voluntary. States tend to be aggressively expansionist, trying to expand their territory as much as possible. And people with their own tribal and band-based political systems, like the Khoisan, and like many tribal societies and chiefdoms in North and South America, have increasingly found themselves forced into state societies against their will. In many cases, they try as much as possible to retain their own internal political organization, which in many cases is closely tied to traditional ways of organizing religion, kinship, and economic activity. For many of the people studied by anthropologists, the story of contemporary political organization is a story of push and pull between traditional tribal authorities and the intrusion and increasing dominance of external states.